Okay, folks, I have 10 o'clock. I'm Dave Apsley. I'm a forester and natural resource specialist with OSU Extension, and I'm going to let my other presenters introduce themselves in order that they're on the screen. So we'll let Stephanie start.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Downs. I work for the Ohio Division of Forestry. I am a service forestry coordinator for the southern third of the state. So I work with our service foresters in this area to deliver resources and assistance to private landowners. And I also serve as a liaison with another government agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thanks for joining us.
John, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I look like I'm on the top of the screen. Anyway, my name is John Morton. I'm a private lands biologist with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and I service southeastern Ohio, the 19 counties that I serve from basically Tuscarawas County to Lawrence and Scioto County. I provide assistance with landowners who want to do wildlife projects to improve or enhance habitat on their property.
Great, thanks, John.
Good morning. Yep, my name's Tom Macy. I'm the Forest Health Program Administrator for the ODNR-Division of Forestry. So in that capacity, I work mainly on invasive insect and disease pests of forests and trees, invasive plants as well, across the whole state.
Okay, Danny, go ahead and introduce yourself. I've got two folks on, Danny and Jessica, who are just going to help today manage the chat and the questions, and they're here to help you if you're having technical difficulties. You can communicate with them through chat. So Danny.
Hi, I'm Danny Gill. I'm the Wildlife Forest Technician for Hocking Soil and Water Conservation District. And like Dave said, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A. If you have any technical issues, pop them in the chat.
Okay, Jessica.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jess Bowen. I am the Agricultural and Natural Resources Educator for OSU Extension in Vinton County. Same as Danny, I'm here to help with any issues you have. Just let us know.
Okay, and before we get started, I have one person with their hand raised. Neil, I don't know if you can, I'll just turn you on and let you talk. You should be able to turn on your mic, Neil, if you have a question before we get started.
No, good morning. Neil Caldwell. We have the farm and forest in Belmont County, close to Monroe County. And I think I just inadvertently pressed the chat button. And, just say hi.
If nothing else, you kind of our guinea pig this morning, Neil. So if folks have questions, you can hit the little raise your hand thing and we can turn you on and off. We've got a pretty full agenda, so probably the best way to communicate is through chat at this point.
Yep. No problem. Thanks.
Thanks. And with that, let's move forward. Today we've got advice from the woods. So we've had 20 some questions submitted in advance. We're going to do our best to answer those questions, although some of them are pretty detailed and could take a whole hour each. Some will be pretty quick and short and sweet. So we'll work our way through those questions as we go. You can use the Q&A session and put questions in the chat. And then what I would recommend, I did not put names with the questions because some people may or may not want their name out there. But if you are the one that submitted the question that's up and we didn't fully answer it, or if you want to clarify anything, raise your hand and we'll pull you into the discussion. So you guys think of anything else I'm forgetting, Stephanie or Tom or John?
Might just mention up front that if you put a question in the Q&A that's not pre-submitted, we will try our best to get to those at the end, but we are going to try to work through those questions that were submitted ahead of time first, just so you understand how we're working today.
Okay, so this is part of our Day in the Woods series. For those of you that are new, we offer a program during non-COVID times, usually from May through November on the second Friday of the month, and usually somewhere in southeastern Ohio, oftentimes at the Vinton Furnace State Forest. It's a collaborative effort. We've got lots of partners. I will mention we have one program planned for March, and then we are meeting in a week or two to figure out how we're going to address the remainder of 2021. My guess is we'll do a few more virtuals, and then we'll keep an eye on the COVID situation. And as soon as we can, we'll start offering some live programming at the Vent and Furnace and other places, but we just don't know when that'll happen. And we may try to do some hybrid stuff. So if you can't join at least the classroom part ahead of time, we'll at least record and make some of that available to you later. Just a reminder, this website has lots of good information, u.osu.edu/Southeast Ohio Woods, and Jessica or Danielle will stick that in the chat window for you. But we've got lots of good videos out there. I think we're about 35 tree ID videos. All the previous programs we've done, there are recordings from there. And then we've got a series of chainsaw safety videos out there as well. And if you're not already subscribed, this is a good way to get updates on what's happening. So if you go to this point and hit subscribe by email, when we do a post about future programming, you'll get a reminder, a notification. And then we've also got a Facebook presence where we introduce our tree ID videos. So that's out there as well. And with that, we'll jump right in. So the first question, what is the timeline for a white oak tree that has died and still be used for lumber or boards? So Stephanie has talked to some experts and she's going to relay the answer to that question.
So as you guys will probably see, a lot of these questions have multiple factors that are going to play into our answer. And that is also true in this question. And the first question that I would ask is, what is the intended use? Are you looking to sell that tree to a mill to have it commercially harvested? Or are you going to take that tree down, cut it up locally, maybe it's a wood miser, borrowed sawmill, or local sawmill, and use the wood yourself? The biggest issue with white oak that is seen is that once it dies, the longer it stands, the more mineral staining you get in the wood, the discoloration of the wood that actually lowers the quality of the wood from a commercial standpoint. So the rule of thumb that I was given is that if the white oak tree is standing and it still has the fine branches, it can be commercially sold as a regular log. Once those fine branches start to fall off though, you're gonna start seeing that mineral staining in the wood, and you're gonna start having more insects attack, such as ambrosia beetles, which burrow small holes into the wood. They can actually go fairly deep and start putting defects into your highest grade lumber, that outside clear wood. The longer it stands, you're gonna start getting decay in the sapwood, the lighter color wood that was alive the most recent, and it's gonna start to break down. If it's a large enough tree, you can still take that tree down. You could still run it on a wood miser, but you're gonna have a lot of waste. So you're gonna have to cut off basically the outside of the wood that has started to decay before you get to the solid heartwood that should still be good. So it's gonna depend on a lot of different factors, whether or not you are selling that as lumber or you're gonna use it yourself and what your personal preferences are. Should have a few years at least before it is unusable for anything, because white oak is a pretty rot resistant wood in and of itself. And so it's gonna stand pretty well as long as it is standing. Once it's on the ground, your timeline speeds up very rapidly and you're gonna wanna get that out and at least get it up and off the ground for it to be good.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Next one, I'm going to attempt to take. This is a class in itself. It's actually something that you could, it's a forest measurements class that we taught at Hocking College that would be a semester long and meet weekly. But describe a forest industry and how to complete one and the resulting documentation and what it looks like. And the real answer to that is it depends on what you need the inventory for. If you're interested in wildlife management, you might want to inventory a totally different way. It could even include game cameras to see what wildlife are using your property. So an inventory can be as simple or as complicated as your goals and objectives. And I would probably work with a professional forester or wildlife biologist to design an inventory that meets your needs. It may be a simple walk with someone like John, if you're into wildlife, and have him talk to you and point out some of the habitat elements that are there and that are missing. And that might be an inventory, and you might take notes and things you can improve. But if you really want a detailed inventory to see what's out there and what's going on in the ground, I recommend putting out some plots. And if you're putting out a plot to measure trees on, we typically use a circular plot because it's simple. It's hard to lay out a square in the field to measure with. It takes forever. But if you put a stake in the ground and stretch a tape out, and you know the radius that goes along with a certain size plot, it's pretty simple to do. What I highly recommend is working with a forester or biologist to develop a stand map. So you don't want to just put plots all out on your property. What I'd recommend is breaking it into the types of habitat or woods you have. For instance, the yellow outlined area on my property is an oak hickory or an oak dominated forest. This was a Virginia pine stand, and this is more of a bottomland hardwood stand. So I would probably inventory each of those separately. I would put some plots in each of those. And probably for most landowners, 10th acre might be the easiest. 5th acre is getting to be a pretty large plot, but I would put a stake in the ground and spread them out so that they're covering the area well. Ideally, a plot per acre with a 10th acre survey would give you, 10% inventory, probably more than you'd need, but just systematically put them out there so they're covering each of those stands. And we can talk those details later. And then you're going to start collecting some data. Probably one of the biggest deals is you need to know your trees, the species, and you probably want to gather the diameter. So if you want to measure change over time, painting the trees with a number or somewhere tagging them, and usually paint mark works really well, or creating a little map, and then measuring their diameter is a good thing to do. Again, we usually measure that at 4.5 feet above the ground. And for the most precise measurement, a D-tape or diameter tape works. This tape, each inch is actually 3.14 inches. So when we stretch it around the circumference, it'll give us the diameter to the nearest tenth. And they make a pocket version for a landowner around the $20 range or so. And then you'll want some kind of form. So you would record the species and the diameter, height, maybe, maybe not. For most landowners, it's not that critical. And then whatever other information you want. This form actually comes from a publication on crop tree management. And I like that because it's a way to, okay, this tree is a potential timber crop tree. So you'd put a T in the little square. If it's a potential wildlife crop tree, you could put a W in there. If it's both, you could put both. And then there's other information you could collect, like, is it free to grow? And again, that's more detail than we can go into today, and I'll show you the pub that this comes from. But if you're using a 10th acre plot, each tree on that plot would represent 10 trees per acre. So you would put a 10 in here. If you were using a 5th acre plot, you would put a 5. And then at the end, you, within that stand, average all those numbers out, and it'll tell you how many trees you have by the different species and size class. Probably about as detailed as we can get. If you really want to do an inventory on your own, I really recommend contacting your private lands biologist, your service forester. If you're in a county that has someone like Danielle, who is a forester that works for the local soil and water, you can contact them to get advice and lay out your inventory, and then you can move forward with that. Here's just a link to a pub that gets into that crop tree management fact sheet that I referenced. And if Danny or Jessica can pop that into the chat window, I don't know if I can just copy it off of here or not. Probably not. Nope. So if you can copy that in there, that would be good. And so with that, hopefully I got that answered. I do see a question that's related, and that is, what's a wildlife crop tree? And that's really any tree that provides benefits to wildlife that you're interested in managing for. So it could be an oak tree that's producing acorns. It could be something that produces cavities for trees for wildlife to nest in. So that depends on your objectives. And I think the purpose of a wildlife survey, John, you want to pitch in on that? That was a question that came in the question and answer session. Why would you do some kind of survey or inventory?
Well, normally when we're, if I'm with a landowner and they have wildlife interests, it's not so much composition as it is structure. So, but it's a combination of the two. knowing what tree species you have on your property, which ones provide food in the form of hard mast or soft mast, and then determining, what different growth stages the stands might be in, whether you're lacking young forest habitat or if most of your woods is old, mature woodland stands. So it's a combination of both. And it's important to know what you have on your property because that'll determine what wildlife species you'll see.
Yeah, and that's something I probably should have mentioned. It gives you that starting point. It gives you a record of where you are. And then with the expertise like John, he could say, okay, if you really want this species here, you're missing this habitat element. So how can we move towards adding some of that habitat element? And then over time, you can measure and see if you're successful. But it gives you that starting point. So you know where you stand, and then you can use re-inventory to figure out if you've made progress. All right, we probably ought to keep this ball rolling. So Stephanie, I believe, is up to answer this next question.
Yes, we had a question about the Ohio Forest Tax Law, which is OFTL, and performing a timber harvest as the landowner. So under Ohio Forest Tax Law, we do have specific rules related to timber harvesting, primarily to promote sustainable forests into the future. And some of those are rules such as hiring a master logger, someone who is trained to put in best management practices, make sure the area is satisfactorily closed out after timber harvest, using a professional forester to make sure the harvest meets goals and objectives and is following the management plan. As the landowner yourself, you can perform your own timber harvest, but there are certain caveats with that. And so you do have to make sure that the timber harvest you are planning is sustainable and is recommended and is a silviculturally sound harvest, meaning that it meets your objectives now, but also provides a valuable functioning forest into the future as well. So you do have to be careful about how you mark the trees, make sure that it is recommended in your management plan, make sure that it follows that plan, that it meets your objectives, and that it keeps your woods healthy into the future. If you are doing your own cutting, you have to make sure you install best management practices to keep your trails from eroding, soil erosion, stream sedimentation, and all of the unhealthy effects that we try to minimize during a timber sale. If you contract that part out, it still needs to be completed by a master logger. So even if you are overseeing your own harvest, you mark your own trees, but you hire someone to do the cutting, that person does need to be a master logger to meet the requirements of the tax law program. With all of that, the additional question here is if they can assist, if a service forester can assist with marking trees for the harvest. This one's a little bit trickier. So we're not necessarily prohibited from marking trees for a landowner, but most of our service foresters have a very large demand from private landowners, meaning that we try to fit everybody in. We try to provide assistance as best we can, but we also have to watch how much time we spend with each landowner to make sure that we are fairly offering assistance to everyone. So the timing involved in marking trees may be a little bit more than what we have to give to one individual landowner. So we do have to be careful in how many landowners are demanding our attention, which is a good thing. I mean, we want to help as many landowners as we possibly can, but marking those trees may be something that we can't fit in. And that depends on each individual service forester and what their current workload looks like. So they may be able to assist in marking the trees for sale, or they may not be able to, but that's something that you would have to discuss with your service forester personally to see what they're able to assist with. So you have to make sure it follows your management plan. You have to make sure it is silvicultural, meaning that it provides for both the future and your current needs, that it's done correctly, that you don't have any erosion issues or stream issues after the fact, and that it's okayed by your service forester.
Something to add, some counties like Hocking have foresters employed through the local soil and water offices. So if your state service forester can't help you, that's a possibility. And then finally, I'd like to mention that you can harvest your own timber, but sometimes it's not in your best interest. And I really caution you to do a lot of homework, get chainsaw safety training, number one, so you can do it safely. And two, just know what you're doing, because once you cut them, they're perishable and the clock's ticking. And you really need to know the potential buyers, because if you cut them and buck them to their own length, you may reduce the value greatly. And it may be cheaper to let the logger harvest them for the potential buyer, because in a lot of cases you could decrease the value. And I've seen and talked to landowners who have harvested trees, put them in a pile, and then decide to sell them, and then they don't get sold. So you're better off most times selling them standing and marked, or at least knowing where you're selling them and knowing who's going to buy them, what specifications they need before you go in to start harvesting your own. So the person that submitted these questions, I'm pretty sure is capable of doing this on their own, but a lot of landowners just don't realize the detail that goes into that. So we'll move on to the next question. Thanks again, Stephanie, for that one. And I think this one's for you, John.
Yeah, I think so. So to answer what is required to install a vernal pool.
You want to explain what a vernal pool is? Everybody on may not know that.
A vernal pool is a wetland, but it is a wetland that is a sensitive habitat type that's normally small in nature, and it's usually very shallow and can dry. Usually in the summer months, it may dry completely up. And then in the wet years, or in the wet time of year, it'll still retain its water. It's used primarily, well, it's used by all wildlife, but most people associate vernal pools with reptiles and amphibians. So vernal pools, as I said, they are a complex system and they're very sensitive. Normally in a wooded environment, and there's two different places that you could have vernal pools, wooded or non-wooded. What we generally run into in southeastern Ohio when people want to put in a vernal pool, it's usually in the woods, and it's usually an area where it may already be a wet spot or have a natural seep. So when you develop a vernal pool, you got to be careful that you don't upset the system that's already there. And what I mean by that is, if it's a shaded area, in most wooded vernal pools, the shading is what makes it beneficial. So when you go in to try to make one, you don't want to remove too many trees to open the canopy up too much. So you got to be very careful on how you get equipment in to be able to do it. Now, the legality of it on your property, it's legal for you to develop it, but through programs, there are some restrictions on developing vernal pools. So kind of moving into that second part of the question, is there Eqip funding available for developing vernal pools? So just to give you some information on Eqip, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, it's basically a Farm Bill funded program, and it provides cost share for developing vernal pools. It could be coded a couple different ways. If you're developing a vernal pool under a wetland practice, it's going to require soil testing, engineered design, and it could be a long drawn out procedure. But there are other ways to accomplish a vernal pool on private land. One of them is using the Upland Wildlife Management Code in Eqip, which is just a fancy way of how they maneuver their money to pay for projects. But under the 645 code, it's called macro topography. So you can accomplish a vernal pool and have it coded that way. And it's a little easier process in getting a vernal pool put in your property, as opposed to going the whole engineered design method. I know several people that have put vernal pools on their property just on their own, and they've turned out okay. Vernal pools can be installed in the process of a logging operation as skidders and dozers are reclaiming roads and trails and access points. A vernal pool can be created simply by just, maybe gouging out a little bit of the area to create that water retention hole, so to speak. So there's a lot of different ways you can get it on your property. I know people that have actually used shovels, rakes, and hose and actually found a wet seep. And you're talking 10 feet in diameter. Normally on a vernal pool, you don't want to go much bigger than 1/8 to 1/4 acre. You get much bigger than that, then you're basically dealing with a wetland. So hopefully I've answered that question. If you have any more questions on actual specifics of vernal pools, you can contact me and we can have a offline discussion on it.
There was in the panelist chat anyway, there was a comment by Kathleen about no fish in them. So one of the things that makes vernal pools unique is they don't hold water year long, so they don't support fish life, which you would think may not be a good thing, but fish will sometimes or oftentimes consume the young larvae or the young amphibians. So you want them to be able to dry up later in the season. So it's good to have someone like John at least give you some advice on how to build them so they're not too deep and that they retain water for the right length of time. So thanks, John. See what's next. I think Stephanie and I are going to tag team this one. Our good management, and John, please pitch in too, because it kind of crosses over into wildlife and other things too, but our good management practices distinctly separate depending on the purpose of the wooded area. And I guess that's not an easy question. The answer is probably it depends. But I think it's really important for you as a woodland owner to think about what your goals and objectives are for the property. And oftentimes there are many. It could be you want some income, you want some wildlife for game to be able to hunt. You may want to just observe wildlife. You may just want the woodlands for a little serenity and just leave it alone. So you need to think about why you own them, and you need to probably prioritize them. And there are certain things we can do in timber management and forest management that are good for wildlife, but it might be good for some wildlife and not so good for other wildlife. So you really need to think about what you're trying to accomplish. And then oftentimes there are practices that can benefit wildlife and regeneration of a forest, for instance, or the health of the forest. So they don't necessarily have to be separate, but I think you as a woodland owner need to know what they are and kind of have at least a priority list. And then you need to communicate that with your wildlife biologists and your foresters. Stephanie or John, you want to add anything to that? Or
This is one area where it really benefits to work with professionals to take a look at what you currently have and what those practices might be to help you get where you want to go to your end result. So this is really hard to answer without knowing what kind of woods you have, because if it's all mature woods, all similar species, you may just be lacking a little bit of diversity in terms of structure and species. And some of the things that you may do may help to influence that. Maybe putting in some group openings, get some early successional habitat, some shade intolerant species that need full sunlight to diversify a little bit and create those conditions that you want in your woods down the road.
Yeah, I think both forest management and wildlife management can support each other. Probably half of my management plans that I do for wildlife practices, the properties are under a forest management plan, whether it's by a state service forester or a consulting forester. So normally the first thing I do is I consult with that forester and find out a little bit about what he is recommending and how he's recommending it. But if I speak with the landowner and I say, hey, you're lacking young forest habitat, your ground is too wide open and you need to brush some things up. At that point, I get with the service forester or the consulting forester and see if there are ways through his management plan to create some more habitat using their methods. My methods and a forester's methods may not exactly be the same, but I think anytime you're dealing with food, browse, cover, that sort of thing, normally it comes down to the canopy. And if you can remove some of the canopy, however methoded that is, whether it's through crop tree release, your TSI work or whatever, you are promoting vegetation at the ground level. So whether I prescribe that or a forester prescribes it, you're still accomplishing the same goal.
Thanks, John. I think the other thing is that there's the big variable is how big's your property too, because you can have areas, if you have a large property, you can designate some areas for different purposes, and maybe you really ramp up one practice in one area, and maybe the area right close to your home, you don't do as much activity. So the size of your property matters as well. But I think the important thing is everybody's communicating so that you're making sure that you're not cross purpose. And if your goal is to have maximum number of deer on a property and you're in a phase where you're trying to regenerate the forest, then you might have some issues. So you just need to communicate with your professionals. But in most cases, you can, so to speak, have your cake and eat it too. You can have some wildlife benefits. You can have the wildlife benefits you desire and some of the forest and timber benefits you desire too. So Tom gets to jump in here. He's been quiet there. He's also thinking positive about summer coming up too. So he's got a green background too.
Yes.
A little bit maybe fall or late summer there.
Yeah. Looking forward to some warmer weather. So yeah, I'll give a shot on this one. Do cultivars of native trees and plants have a negative effect on the health of wooded areas? And should responsible landowners be planting only straight species in their woods? Yeah, I'll take a shot on this one. I'm certainly not an expert on cultivars and positives and negatives of those. But I'm gonna put into the chat right now, hopefully folks can see that, a link to an article with a lot more information on cultivars and how they may or may not be beneficial to wildlife and the environment. But there's a lot of great information there from a professor from University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy, and he's done a lot of work on this and has some really great resources available to kind of inform this type of question. But a few considerations on this that I'm aware of that you might want to think about with this is, so a cultivar is a cultivated variety. It's short for cultivated variety of a plant. And typically, you'll see these sold in nurseries. They'll have, some name of the cultivar, like, Autumn Splendor Maple or something like that. And basically they're a plant that has some unique feature that someone finds desirable. So it could be, unique foliage color, more flowers or large exotic looking flowers, or heavy fruit production or something like that. And so one thing to consider about these is that to get that trait into all these plants that nurseries are selling, they have to be reproduced asexually. And typically that's done through a cutting of a stem from that original plant, and then it's rooted and grown and propagated and produced and sold. So thinking of that, basically all the individuals of that cultivar are genetically identical. So if you're planting a lot of one type of cultivar, they all have the same genetics. So if you're overusing a single cultivar, you could be, reducing the genetic diversity. And why that's important is, if you have a lot of the same genetically identical plants, they may not have a lot of diversity in resistance to different, insect or disease pests that might come along at some point in the future. They could all essentially be wiped out by that. Whereas if you have a more diverse genetic makeup out there, and that those plants, a few of them may be more resilient to those threats that come along. And I'll also say, I don't think there's been a ton of research on cultivars and how they may be good or not good. So there's still a lot to learn, I think, with these. And I don't think it's a blanket across the board where you can say, you know, all cultivars are bad or good. It's probably going to vary based on each individual cultivar or species that's out there. So another consideration too, with the fact that, you know, they're all genetically identical, derived from one individual plant, you know, if that particular plant, that parent plant, so to speak, was growing a few states away or somewhere really far from where you're wanting to plant them, they may not be that well adapted to the local site conditions where you're planting that plant. So, you know, in that case, I think the best recommendation, if possible, is to always be using native plants from as local of a seed source as you can get them. If you can do that, if you can find that out. And then just to wrap up, I have heard Dr. Talamy mention in some of his resources that there has been some research. I think this was on like herbaceous flowering plants, not necessarily trees and shrubs, but the principles probably still hold true that, you know, certain cultivars, if they're selected for some unique foliage color, like variegated leaves or purple leaves or something like that, in some cases, this again, not a blanket statement, but I think in some cases it's been shown that those plants are less valuable or less used by foliage feeding insects. So there may be less value to those plants for those types of wildlife. And then those cultivars that have unique flower structure or like a double flower or larger flowers, they have been shown to be less valuable for pollinating insects for visiting those flowers. So that's some things to consider. Like I said, I don't think we can say they're all good, they're all bad. It's going to depend on the species, but in general, those are some considerations to think about. And I would just recommend probably always trying to use the straight species from a locally adapted seed source if you can find it.
Thanks, Tom. Next question. Stephanie and I think we're going to answer this one, but we could probably use some input from John on this one because I think he's probably got a suggestion or two. But the best method of dealing with unusable tree brush limbs that provides the best or for overall health of the wooded areas. So the options that they gave are burn brush piles, chip and leave in the woods, chip and remove, or leave the whole limbs in brush in the woods. In forestry, for forestry practices, I would probably almost never recommend chipping. It's just so expensive, and you're putting out this organic matter out there, and you're essentially putting out way too much carbon that's going to break down and may cause some problems to the fertility of the site. And then again, you're going to just disturb a lot more by doing that. So small branches and limbs really don't hurt the woodlands, but they're somewhat unsightly, and we get that complaint a lot. One thing that you can do after a harvest is just what we call lopping limbs. So if you got a big branch out there from an oak, cutting down to the smaller diameters and letting it lay on the ground closer is going to make it decompose quicker. But it really depends. If you're at a regeneration phase, sometimes those limbs and big branches can help give you a little protection from deer browsing. So in most cases, we recommend leaving in the woods. And especially those fine twigs break down, that's where most of the nutrients are in the tree, besides the leaves in these hardwood trees. So there's a lot of nutritional value, and there's a lot of organic matter that will break down slowly and contribute to the fertility of the site and even the moisture relations. Stephanie, anything more to add on the forestry side to that? And then another thought, John, you want to comment on what I just put up there as another alternative?
Yeah, you know, there's actually Eqip practices that in the when you're managing your woodlands, whether it's a timber harvest or TSI, um, you know, down tree structures and brush piles and things like that are beneficial to small game uh, and woodland birds. But I think also in dealing with a down tree structure, as opposed to burning it or destroying it by chipping or whatever, the insects and the decomposition process of the log itself is more beneficial for other smaller, lesser concerned about wildlife species than we even realize. There's a lot of critters out there that utilize those down tree structures, those logs that are just laying along the hillside. And we're dealing with a grouse population that has declined in the last 10 years too. So at one time, you know, leaving a log or two on the ground was a management practice specifically for ruffed grouse as a drumming site. So I think unless the harvest is like a super heavy harvest, it may require some manipulation of the logs to improve the aesthetics of your woods. And I know that's been done on several projects I've been on. So aesthetics mean a lot to people. So, but organizing and putting out brush piles is a good way to use the leftover tree product. You don't want to go too many more than 4 per acre if you're going to do it.
Okay, thanks. Tom, you're back up.
Yeah, so this question deals with beech leaf disease. So several years of beech leaf disease in my predominantly beech maple beech hemlock woods is causing canopy thinning. What action should be taken now to maximize the long-term health of the woods in preparation for the inevitable loss of the beeches? So yeah, beech leaf disease, it's a relatively new forest health issue that seems to mainly be impacting forests in northeastern part of Ohio. And this image here shows a pretty heavily impacted stand where we've got thinning and dieback, and we can see that the classic dark banding, you know, in the leaves there. So with beech leaf disease, we're still learning a lot about it. What causes it? How quickly does it spread? How quickly does it kill trees? What's the long-term impacts going to be, and what can we do to manage it? So that's a big question that folks have been asking. And at this time, there aren't any known or approved, you know, chemical treatments or you know, specific treatments to try to save trees. So at this time, you know, just implementing accepted good forest practices to manage your woods is what we would recommend. So in that case, it would be, you know, trying to work with a service forester to try to manage your woods properly. I will say, you know, if you do have beech trees that are affected by beech leaf disease and you cut it down or cut parts of the tree down to try to minimize movement of that material off your land. We don't know for sure all the mechanisms that this issue is spreading around. So just to be cautious and avoid moving this problem to other areas, try to minimize movement of that plant material away from the area. And of course, you know, if any dead or dying trees pose a safety hazard near your home or in areas that you're frequently in your woods, try to mitigate that. Typically, you know, getting an assessment from a certified arborist is a good idea, and having a professional remove that tree to make it safe to be around that area again. Another consideration to think about is in a lot of these beech stands that are declining from beech leaf disease, there's a lot more sunlight coming into the stand and reaching the forest floor. And in some cases, you know, if there are non-native invasive plants present or in the area, that additional light can really result in a proliferation of those invasive plants in that stand. So that's something to keep an eye on and potentially try to control those invasive plants, either yourself or, you know, if it's a large area, you might be able to get assistance through the Eqip program, working with a service forester to get some help in controlling the invasives there. And then one thing I'm going to wrap up with, I'll share this link. Coming up on April 15th is going to be a free online webinar all about beech leaf disease, all the current knowledge of it, and recommendations and science that we have on it. So I'm just going to put that link in the chat right now. So if folks are interested, they can get a lot more information about beech leaf disease at that webinar.
Thanks, Tom. Let's wait for that to pop in here before I go to the next question. I'll actually bring up the next question. And this is one I want some input from the audience. You guys have been out there, and I hate this method of presenting, but with 95 people on, we can't have everybody's mics on. But I do like to get some interaction going. So what are 2 or 3 of the most compelling reasons to preserve forest lands in Ohio? So if each of you that's participating would just put one in, that would be awesome. And then we can use that as the conversation starter. So find your little chat window and just start typing your responses in, if you would, please. CAUV tax benefits, bird habitat. Okay, they're starting to roll in now. I see recreation. And I'm not sure. I think most of these, I don't think you can put these to everybody. So we'll have to kind of summarize these and read them back out. But I'm getting lots of environmental conservation, carbon sequestration, promoting diversity of wildlife, anything I haven't mentioned, future generations, stormwater and runoff issues, hardwood timber, legacy for children, biodiversity, air and water quality, wildlife, help mitigate climate change. I don't know how you prioritize these. I can't. We all have our different priorities, but I think it's important to realize that forests are important for a lot of reasons. The question specifically mentions preserving forest lands, and sometimes we get confused of what that means and we get into debates about it, but preserve and conserve are 2 terms that you'll see. Conserve is wise use, and preserve usually means kind of hands off. And I'm a big proponent a lot of times of wise use. I'm tongue tied today, because sometimes there are outside influences that if we don't wisely manage them, for instance, invasive species, then we can have some issues. So tons of reasons out there, erosion control popping in. So I don't know that we can add to the answer any better than what you folks have already done, but forests are important for lots of reasons, and they're owned. Most of the forest land or woodland in Ohio is owned by private individuals. So you folks all play a role, and you provide all these benefits to the citizens of Ohio and the citizens of the United States. So really want to congratulate you and thank you for doing that, because we've got about 1/3 of our state in forest land, and you folks are playing a big role in that. Anything else to add, any of my other panelists, to that? Okay, well, hopefully you're awake now. And we'll move on to a very similar question. What are some of the threats? And Tom, you want to give this an attempt? This is a whole webinar in itself too. So
yeah, this is a big one. So yeah, you know, thinking about what are the biggest threats to our woodlands in Ohio, and you know, what about climate, development, invasives? And I would just say yes. Yeah, I don't know that there is consensus on what the biggest threat is. You know, there's a few key threats and issues out there that I think are really important. I will mention just at the end of 2020, we with other partners completed an update of the Ohio Forest Action Plan. And one big purpose of the Forest Action Plan is to identify what are those big threats and what can we do to address those into the future. So that Forest Action Plan, it's currently with the U.S. Forest Service awaiting official approval and sign off. And once that happens, which hopefully will be in the next few weeks, that plan will be on our website. So I would urge folks to take a look at that for more information on questions like this. But yeah, I mean, you know, if I were to pick, in my opinion, and based on, you know, the information that I have and what's in the Forest Action Plan, really the three listed here, I think are some of the top concerns that we have for forests in Ohio. You know, changing climate, what is that going to bring? There's a lot of research going into that. You know, I think there's certain tree species that we're learning that, you know, may not be too impacted and may in fact benefit from projected changes in climate. You know, there may be more severe weather events. There's a potential for more summer drought, and of course a warming climate that may actually benefit certain species that we have in Ohio. And then on the other hand, certain tree species may be negatively affected and see declines as a result of that. So that's a big concern. Development, that's a big one. So, you know, fragmentation of contiguous forest blocks due to expanding suburban and urban areas, that's a threat to forests in Ohio. And of course, invasive species. So that there seems to be, you know, an accelerated rate of invasive insects and diseases and plants that are coming into our forests every year. So those three really seem really, really big to me. But yeah, there's a whole list of issues that are threatening Ohio's forests. So I don't know if folks have others to add, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, and they're all interrelated too. If you think about, you know, especially development and invasives and how they can be interrelated. So it's hard to pick one. And climate may make, you know, species more susceptible to some of the invasive insects, some of the changes and some of the disturbance. So it's hard to pick one, but there are lots of threats, and the best, I guess, armor against some of these threats is just good forest management. Trying to maintain diversity in your forest, trying to manage your invasive plants, and trying to keep trees that are healthy is the best thing you can do as woodland owners to try to have an impact on these threats to the woodlands. This was a hard one for me to answer. Have I read the book, The Hidden Life of Trees? And before I got the question, the answer was no, but I did order it and got it fairly recently, so I haven't read the whole book, but I got through and read probably 2/3 of it. It's an interesting book. Peter Wollenberg, the author's from Germany. He has a background in forest management. And I think it's a really good book, and there's some really neat lessons. The big thing is it really discusses and describes physiological and ecological processes that happen in our trees and in our woodlands. And a lot of times the tree physiology just in college was more than I could handle. There's a lot of chemistry, there's a lot of physics, there's a lot of stuff that was just beyond what my brain could take in. And Peter does a really nice job of simplifying a lot of those concepts. But in the process, he may oversimplify and overgeneralize and make it almost too simple. And then he does something that's kind of unique and I think is great to get people's attention and to make things understandable. But he gives trees characteristics of people and animals, and anthropomorphism, I can't even say the word, but he talks about trees having feelings and being able to think and to remember and to actually scream. And for me, that's a hard leap to make in my brain, but I do think it's a good book, and it really does describe and help people to understand that forest and forest ecosystems are a lot more complicated, and there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we need to learn. But I think, and he's actually really critical of foresters and the profession, and he's pretty critical of even plant biologists. But I think the thing to keep in mind is a lot of us with that background, whether it's wildlife biology or forestry, have the best interest in the woods, and we all have biases. But I think it's a good read, and it's worth reading. But also realize it's based on his experiences in a forest in Germany, which in some cases is quite a bit different than a lot of our forests that we have here. And so you got to take that with a grain of salt, but there's lots of good nuggets of information in there, and I highly recommend reading it and thinking about it and asking a lot of questions. Okay, Tom left us on this one. I think Stephanie and I are listed as the ones to answer this, but when Tom joins back in, he can also add to it. But the question refers to that we often don't make a distinction between forests that were cleared and those that have been cleared and used for other purposes, either agriculture. Because if folks don't realize it, we've got a great graphic that Division of Forestry produced that shows that Ohio was down to about 12% forest. We started out probably 95+% forest cover before European settlement. Due to land clearing, and I have to always defend the forest industry, foresters get blamed for clearing all the land, but it wasn't foresters that cleared most of the land. It was farmers. It was settlers that cleared land to be able to farm it and to put it to other use. A lot of that wood was basically not utilized, but it was cleared, a lot of it. Some of it was not cleared, but had major impacts from things like cattle, high intensity cattle grazing. There's very little woods, and you could probably argue none that hasn't had at least some cutting in it. Those few properties that arguably haven't had or preserved for the most part. But so there's really not two categories of cleared and uncleared. There's a whole range, and it grades from cleared recently to never really having been cleared, and having little impact from harvesting. So the question is why is there no distinction between the two? And I if you work with a forester or a wildlife biologist, when we walk your woods, we're always looking for past land use, because that influences the forest we've got today and helps explain what's there. It's part of the equation that is in the back of our brain when we're in the woods to try to figure out, well, why is this forest dominated by hickory? Well, maybe it's because everything but hickory was harvested, or maybe, livestock impacts. So we do make distinctions. I think most foresters, when they're writing a management plan, will even separate a woods into different stands based on past land use. But I think it's a mistake to ignore that past land use, because what's there may not be the ideal species for that site. It may be a piece of property was cleared or had such heavy intensive grazing on it that almost all the species were removed, and the only species that came in after it was abandoned was what was grown on the fence line close by, and it might have been an ash tree. And so you got an ash dominated forest, where prior to that site may be capable of growing a healthy oak dominated or oak hickory forest. So I think it's important to realize not only the site capabilities, that past land use, and then realize past land use affects soil quality, soil properties. If you've got a site that's got Virginia pine on it, I almost guarantee it was heavily abused by agriculture. You've had major erosion, major compaction issues. And so, that site has changed. And so we're going to treat it differently, and it's going to take more time to get it back into production of other hardwood species. So with that, Stephanie or Tom, you have anything else to add to that discussion?
Identifying that past land use may be critical for your future management, because it does impact so many features of your ecosystem. So your soil may once have been able to support a very diverse forest type. And around here, you might have more mining history, may have severely degraded your forest or degraded your soils and changed the biology. And so that's going to indicate where you can go with your woods and kind of help set limitations on maybe some of your objectives.
Yeah, my property, there's this huge deer scrape on my property, and it's black. Guess what? It's coal. It's coal spoil. So yeah, this property has had mining influences. It's had heavy grazing influences. It's had some high grade timber harvesting, and it's had some row cropping on the little bit of flat ground I've got. So all those impacts are there. And what's amazing is how Mother Nature finds a way, because I've still got some beautiful trees and some nice forests too. So one thing I should mention though, I really recommend checking with your local NRCS or local soil and water office, or going online to look for the oldest aerial imagery you can find. Because there's lots of good clues. If you can find an old 1930 or 1940, 1950 aerial image of your property, it'll tell you a lot of the answer, it'll help you answer a lot of those questions about what's happened in the past. So I think that covers that one about as well as we're going to be able to cover it. Let's move on. Number 13. And John, you want to take a stab at this one to start, and then we can pitch in. You're muted, John, sorry.
Yeah,
there we go.
That's kind of a long question, and with not such an easy answer, but I think the way I would answer it is that everything in a forest is interconnected. So wildlife, it's not a matter of which one came first, the chicken or the egg. In many times, it's a symbiotic relationship between healthy forests and healthy wildlife populations. So anytime you increase the diversity of your woodlands by doing many different practices, you're benefiting wildlife. And those wildlife species depend on those habitat practices that you're doing in the woodlands. So wildlife require basically different habitat types throughout the course of their life cycle: grassland, young forest habitat, old fields, wetlands, mature woods. So anytime you can provide a more diverse habitat on your property, the more wildlife you're going to have.
Yep, and I think your answer, interconnected, is the word that came in my brain too. It's a web. It's hard to know what's driving the train, but they are all interconnected and interrelate. A good example, we've got a graduate student from Ohio State doing research on blue jays at the Benton Furnace State Forest. We're learning so much about the role blue jays play in moving acorns. They're actually putting little tracers in acorns. They're looking at creating almost like, it looks like a checkerboard, and putting different types of acorns at different sizes to see what they prefer. And then they've got trackers on blue jays to know how far they're moving acorns. And they can actually trace and find those acorns where they were moved to. So there's a lot we don't know. And it kind of comes back to the book that we mentioned earlier, The Hidden Lives of Trees. There's a lot we don't know, and especially in how wildlife and forests and woodlands interact. So they both are so interdependent that it's really hard to answer that question. And there's probably no answer other than they're both really important. Cicadas, Tom.
Yeah, so this question is the 17-year cicadas is emerging this May. What should I expect? How might it affect the woods? So yeah, the main thing is go out and get a nice, good pair of earplugs, I would say, because it's going to get noisy. But yeah, so Dave has a slide here showing where that brood 10, represented by that Roman numeral there, brood 10, that's going to be emerging this year. It's mainly in western part of Ohio. So that'll probably occur. The cicadas basically emerge when the soil temperature about 8 inches down reaches 64 degrees, which typically happens around mid-May here in Ohio. So that's what will trigger their emergence from the soil. And then basically they're in the final nymph stage when they crawl out of the soil. And this usually happens at night. They'll crawl up onto trees or homes or fences, and then pretty quickly do their final molt into an adult, which you can see there in Dave's pictures as well, kind of coming out of that nymphal skin and emerging as an adult with wings. So yeah, that'll happen in mid-May. Pretty soon thereafter, the male cicadas will begin to chorus or kind of sing and make their classic cicada noises. And where they're real dense, it's going to be pretty loud. And so they'll do that chorusing, to attract females and then mate. And so, this will happen, late May, all through June probably, and it should kind of fade off sometime in early July. And so, the cicadas, what impacts are they going to have? So they will feed. They have a piercing, sucking mouth part. They will feed on plants, a whole variety of different plants, but that feeding really doesn't do a whole lot of damage. But it's the female behavior, their egg laying behavior, or oviposition, as we call it, that will be doing damage to plants. And that's shown in this photo here. The female has an ovipositor that essentially kind of cuts a slit into twigs of plants, which you can see there, and that's where she deposits eggs into the twigs of these plants. And so what then happens over time after she does that is a lot of times that twig can be killed from that oviposition point outwards to the end of the twig. And that's what you're starting to see there in that photo, some browning and wilting, also known as flagging, where you get that discoloration in those leaves on a single branch. But you'll start to see that, the flagging, the dying of the ends of these twigs on the trees, that'll probably become more apparent at the end of June, first part of July, kind of when the cicadas are dying down, and the end of their life, the life cycle kind of comes to an end. But you'll start to see that flagging, and while it can look pretty devastating and bad, for an otherwise healthy, established tree or shrub, it's not going to do any significant long-term damage to that tree. But where it is a concern would be for real small plants or newly planted trees or shrubs in a landscape or forested situation. If the trees were just planted that year, this oviposition damage can kill those newly planted trees and shrubs. So, you could either use some sort of netting over the plant to reduce that, or the better option may be, if you're planning to plant in areas where these cicadas may be, you may just want to defer that planting until the fall of this year or spring of next year. It might be the way to go to try to avoid, mortality caused by this from the small trees and shrubs. But other than that, just try to enjoy this kind of rare opportunity to see this really neat thing happening. And really, all in all, the cicadas are really beneficial for the environment. They provide a great food source for a lot of wildlife, birds and mammals, and really they're not doing any significant damage to our forests. Like I said, they can damage newly planted plants. But all in all, it's just a really cool thing to observe and try to enjoy it if you can.
So John, I recall some presentations by some of your colleagues about a particular game species of bird that really can benefit from cicadas. The wild turkey seems to really do well a few years after cicadas. You want to kind of address that or talk about that briefly?
Yeah, I think most people that are avid turkey hunters or just like to see turkeys around will notice that the recruitment of poults the years following a cicada emergence. I can't give you specific details, but there is a noted increase in the number of poults in a particular flock or a clutch that make it into that next breeding year, just simply because of the added food source that's out there. I mean, it's just amazing. Turkeys generally, the young poults are generally insect eaters the first 6 months of their life anyway. They spend a lot of time in fields eating grasshoppers and various other insects. So when we have these cicada emergence, it's like the amount of food is doubled for them. So the amount of, you know, those birds are definitely relying on that extra food, and they make it into the next year. So yeah, it does. It does make an impact.
Yeah. One of the things, if I recall, I think it was Mike Reynolds mentioned too, that there's so much food around, they don't have to go far to get the protein they need from insects.
Right.
So there are just fewer of them that they get eaten by predators too, because they can kind of hang out closer to where they've got a little more cover and a little more protected. So it's all interconnected. Back to that previous question. Great, thanks. Can you talk a little about shaded understory trees? And the probably answer is no, not a little. It's going to take more than a little to answer the questions that are related. You know, the submitter mentioned they got a lot of small 1 to 2 inch diameter trees that are 10 to 12 feet tall and very spindly. Should they clear them out? Are they good for the wildlife? And the answer is, it depends. Next question, right? So Stephanie, you want to help kind of ferret that out a little bit?
Yeah, this is another one that kind of depends on what's in your forest and what your goals are down the road. So, I mean, it depends on what species you have, whether they're shade tolerant, whether they're blocking light to the forest floor, if they're limiting regeneration. If your trees are mature and you really need that regeneration, you may need to clear out some of these small 1 to 2 inch red maple, sugar maple, beech that are creating really shaded conditions and stopping a lot of your regeneration of seedlings. And so sometimes, yes, you may want to clear those out. Sometimes, yes, they are good for wildlife and you may want to leave them. Sometimes they're desirable species.
Sometimes they're your future forest that you're really wanting to manage for too, depending on their species. So
maybe you just want to thin some of them and keep some of them that are there. And maybe sometimes you do need to get rid of all of them, but it's going to vary a lot on multiple aspects of your woods.
The only time it would be yes, as the answer is if they were non-native invasives, then you'd probably want to get rid of them. But if they're native, then you really, they may not be hurting anything. You may not benefit from getting rid of them. Or you may do harm by getting rid of them. So just do some homework and get some advice and get a walk in the woods with your biologist or your forester to decide if it makes sense to try to remove them. Tom, you get the short straw on this one. I'll let you answer the carbon sink question here.
Yeah. So question here is, I keep hearing more about forests being used as carbon sinks and landowners get paid to maintain forests. Could you comment on this concept? I have no idea if a good, bad thing, or even realistic. So I will give a huge disclaimer on this one that I am far from an expert on this topic. I know a little bit about it that I'll share, but I'm sure that there's others out there that could give a lot more insight on this one. So, you know, as I understand this forest carbon credit market is sort of a newly developing area that's getting more attention and interest lately. And my understanding of it is basically, you know, polluting companies or industries, they have to offset the greenhouse gas emissions that they produce by purchasing carbon credits for projects or conservation activities that would increase carbon sequestration to kind of, in a way, attempt to cancel out the greenhouse gas emissions that they're producing. And, you know, we know that trees and forests sequester carbon as they grow in their wood. So there's some organizations that are offering payments to forest landowners not to convert their forests to other land uses, or in some cases do sustainable forest management that might increase the rate of carbon sequestration on their land, so that these companies can purchase and basically pay that landowner to do that. So like I said, I don't know a lot about it. There is, I'm gonna put another link into the chat if I can. But you know, to truly offset a unit of greenhouse gas emissions, the credits really should be purchasing or protecting forest land that would otherwise, you know, be converted to some other land use, or reforest an area that's not currently in forest cover. So there's a lot of questions and nuances to this that I am not an expert in by any means. But I do know that the Nature Conservancy has a program called the Working Woodlands program. And I believe it is such a program where, you know, there's incentives and payments to landowners to, you know, more or less permanently protect their forested land and do some sustainable management on that forested land. So I was going to share here in the chat a link to more information about that TNC program that might be useful to check out if you're interested in that.
So to add just a little bit more, if back to that inventory question, you have to, or at least historically, if you were going to get paid for sequestering carbon, you have to document the rate that's going on now, or have an inventory that's much more detailed than what we talked about earlier, to be able to quantify where you are and how much carbon that forest is sequestering, and then show that your management is enhancing that or improving that. But over time, there was a time when the Chicago Climate Exchange was, you know, carbon was traded. There was a time also where companies were actually working with private land holdings to pay them to offset their carbon credits. And some folks got in on the ground floor of that and actually got an annual payment for it. But right now, there aren't that many opportunities for woodland owners, but it's something to keep an eye on because it may change over time. But forests are critical in sequestering carbon. In fact, I got an email from one of the participants who registered for this that shared an article that showed really how forests are becoming more efficient at sequestering carbon too, as we have higher CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So something to keep an eye on and keep up with. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of expertise on the panel right now in this area. So hopefully we address it to satisfy the needs here. So John, here's one. It's pretty specific about a woodchuck.
Okay, so basically any nuisance wildlife or animal that you have falls under the Ohio Revised Code. There's laws in place on how you can deal with them. Groundhogs fall into a category of animals that can be trapped year round and they can be relocated. Now, with that being said, is it in the best interest of the animal to relocate it? That basically depends on the age of the animal, and if you think you got them all. For instance, if you move an animal, you may be orphaning other animals. You may be spreading disease if there is some disease in that animal. And also just the overall trapping experience from the animal's perspective. You may create enough stress in that animal that when you relocate it, it's so far stressed that it is not going to survive. But in most cases, if it's an adult groundhog, you're not going to have any problem with that animal making it if you move it from one property to the other. Just make sure you got the landowner's permission before you do any of that kind of stuff. And like I said before, with groundhogs, especially groundhogs that live under houses, trailers, barns, or whatever, if you just catch one and it's an adult and you move it, you may have just orphaned a bunch of young groundhogs. The other part of that moving wildlife is that you're just moving one problem from one place and moving it to another place. So that's something to consider if you're thinking about moving groundhogs or any wildlife for that matter.
And chances are, if you've got the habitat, another one will fill right in behind it. So a lot of times, if you've got a problem that's causing a groundhog to come to your foundation, you need to try to figure out how you can eliminate that problem, or it'll just repeat itself over time. So that's another consideration, I think. Okay, Stephanie, you want to help me with this one? Landowner down in Highland County mentioned they purchased a 22-acre woodland. Part is planted to mature white pines. The remainder is mature hardwoods. What process should we follow to manage the property with the goal to practice conservation, keep the woodland natural, and increase wildlife, and create a legacy for our children? So I'll let Stephanie start off on this one, and I'll pitch in a little bit. And by all means, the other panelists can pitch in too.
Yeah, so looking at the goals that they laid out here, maybe your summary goal might be just to keep your woods healthy so that you can meet all of the rest of these. One issue we commonly see with planted mature white pines is that a lot of times these areas are planted, but then the maintenance on them kind of falls through the cracks. And so the first question with your pine plantation would be to look at whether or not it has been thinned, because we've had a lot of health issues lately with white pine in the state, and Tom may be able to jump in on this. But I mean, we have insects such as pine bark adelgid that likes really dense stands, basically sucks sap out of the tree and just leads to a general decline when they don't have enough space to grow. We have a lot of needle issues. We have white pine needle decline, where there are a lot of fungal pathogens and other diseases that attack the needles of the trees and make them decline that way. And so you really have to look at that pine plantation in terms of the health of the plantation and how much space each of those trees has to grow. It may need thinned if you want to keep those trees long-term. If your pine plantation is overstocked, it's going to decline pretty rapidly once it reaches maturity. So you have to make sure that that's managed correctly, or that it has been managed in the past. Along the same line, white pine is not native to Highland County. So in Ohio, white pine is native to a very small area up in Northeast Ohio, and it's widely planted around the state, but it's not a natural tree for that area. And so it may do well for a time, but when you plant a tree outside of its native range, you really have to watch those trees because they're not adapted to the soils or the climate. And there's other little factors in your ecosystem that are going to play in. So making sure they're taken care of, that they're thinned properly, and that they're healthy will keep them there if that's what you want. It can also help you buy time to get regeneration in that stand that is native, that will replace it over time and keep it as woods. It may not be a conifer woods long-term, but you want to make sure you keep your invasive plants out, and that some plants are establishing, native plants are establishing to continue wooded area in that stand in the future. In your hardwood area, it's going to be pretty similar. Make sure your woods stay healthy. So make sure you keep out invasive plants. Make sure you're monitoring. Make sure you're looking at anything that might need done to keep those trees healthy. Even hardwoods sometimes need thinned a little bit so that the trees aren't overly stressed and they aren't susceptible to things like drought or insect or disease. And so you're going to look overall at the health. And this is where we really recommend working with a professional, having somebody walk through the woods with you. Take a look at what your issues may be, what your future goals are, and again, those steps to help you follow a plan and meet your objectives while preserving your woods and keeping them healthy, keeping them sustainable, be able to pass on good, sustainable woods to your children. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add on the panel.
I got a little hint. I must have somebody out in the audience that's got a little knowledge here. I won't call them out, but they recommended if the landowner just recently purchased a woodland, and they're thinking about ever doing any type of timber harvesting, that's a great time to think about a timber basis. And a timber basis is a detailed inventory that puts a value on the timber that you've got. And why is that important? When you sell timber down the road, you can actually, when you buy a piece of property, you're paying for timber, land, and whatever improvements you've got, a home and whatever. But when you sell timber, you're going to pay taxes on your net, hopefully. So whatever the sale price is, if you have a timber basis, you can actually have documentation of what you paid for that timber, and it will greatly reduce your tax burden down the road. So something to think about for woodland owners who are just purchasing land. And if they're thinking at all about harvesting timber down the road, and even if timber management isn't the major goal for this woodland owner, there may be some need to do some harvesting to accomplish their goals. For instance, if you wanted to convert part or all of that white pine stand to a hardwood stand, there might be a point in time, you know, especially with some of the diseases we've got coming down the road, that a timber harvest might make sense. So just keeping all that in mind. And I appreciate the little hint that came through on my text here. So
Another thing to keep in mind if you've recently purchased it is you should also have your property boundaries marked. That helps you know where your woods are, but it also helps others know where your woods are and helps limit trespass. And so going through and marking those property boundaries is a really good step to take when you just purchase woodlands, or if you've had them for a while and never marked your property boundaries.
it's also
Clarifies.
Yeah, it's also great to get a forester and a wildlife biologist on the ground early to identify things. For instance, if this white pine needle decline is starting to happen in those white pines, then we're seeing it pretty widespread. And if it's there, it may be that clue to say, hey, maybe we want to be proactive and do something before we lose this resource, because that's something we've just had, probably even ties back to some of the climate and some of the severe weather we've had with some extremely wet growing seasons. White pine's not looking too great right now. So it's just something to keep an eye on, and getting that inventory and getting that starting point is really critical. And this is a stumper that I tried to dig into. And if the person that submitted this wants to throw something in the chat window, if you think we're on the right track or not. But they mentioned that a few years back, they ran into an oak that they weren't familiar with. It looked like it had been planted. So they took it to a forester, and the forester didn't have an idea. So they took it to a forestry group, and they said they thought it was called a Lee oak. And they were asking if it could be Quercus leaii. And I did a little homework, and I couldn't find any reference to Quercus leaii, which Quercus is the genus for oak, and that would be the species name. But probably my best go-to resource, so I'm glad this question got asked, if for no other reason, to introduce folks to The Woody Plants of Ohio by Lucy Braun. And Lucy Braun was from Southeast Ohio. And in one of the most frequent natural hybrids of oaks that occur out there is Quercus leaii, which is a hybrid between black oak and shingle oak. And the foliage can look something like this, or if you realize shingle oak has a leaf that doesn't have any lobing, and you might just find an occasional lobe on it, like you might on a black gum. So my guess is this is the hybrid that they're referencing, but I don't know for sure. And then if you look at the range map from Woody Plants of Ohio, it was definitely fairly prominent down in Southwest Ohio. So Tom, you have anything else to add to that? That's our best guess. If we're on the wrong page and you got anything to add to that, that would be great. But that's my best guess.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. If there were any samples collected or pictures of the tree or leaves or anything, that would be a great help too.
Yeah, and that's a very good suggestion. We're kind of working in the blind. So yeah, if you ever have pictures, feel free to email them to us, and we'll do our best to try to figure it out. All right, Tom, you want to take this one? And then I've got a graphic that'll help you with your answer on the next slide.
Sure. Yeah, so the question is, I would like to add the magnolia acuminata cucumber magnolia to my 4-acre wooded backyard in Southwest Ohio, hoping to plant locally genetic plants or seeds. Can you be of any help or guide me to someone who could help? Yeah, so Dave just put up sort of the native range of cucumber magnolia shown there in green. So, you know, it's predominantly present in the eastern part of the state. Of course, it can be planted anywhere, and I think would grow pretty well anywhere in the state. But this isn't a tree that is widely available or sold in nurseries. I think in some of the more native focused nurseries and growers, it might be starting to become a bit more common. But yeah, I really like this tree too. It's one of my favorites. And the farthest west in Ohio that I have encountered this one growing, which would be closest to southwestern Ohio, is at Shawnee State Forest in southern Ohio in Scioto County. And I've also come across some at Alum Creek State Park in Franklin County. And those particular trees, it's possible that they seeded off of some nearby planted trees and weren't truly natively growing there. But this is also a species that I have collected seed from and was able to successfully germinate some seeds. So I'd be happy to help if you're interested in collecting seeds from those locally growing populations and try to germinate them yourself. It's kind of fun to undertake something like that. Another thought that I have, there is a native tree nursery in Delaware, Ohio, called Riverside Native Trees. And I think they've grown cucumber magnolia before, but it might be worth reaching out to them about. A lot of the plants that they grow are seed collected locally in Ohio or very close outside of Ohio. So that might be a source to consider, but that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Just to add to that a little bit, I'm trying to type and talk at the same time. That's probably not a good idea. But there is a publication that the U.S. Forest Service put out called the Woody Plant Seed Manual. It's available online. And if either Danielle or Jessica can just do a Google search and find Woody Plant Seed Manual, you'll find a link for it. And the Woody Plant Seed Manual is phenomenal. It usually goes to genus, but it'll give you very specifics on when to collect seed, how to collect seed, how to store seed, and then how to germinate it. So if you're interested in trying to germinate any of our native woody plants, that's a great resource for you. Does the seed need to be stored a certain way, or does the surface need to be scarified? That information is there. So the Woody Plant Seed Manual is phenomenal. It's hard to get a hard copy of it anymore. They actually reprinted it probably 10, 15 years ago, but it's a great resource for those of you that like to tinker with plants and to germinate. It'll improve your success rate greatly by just doing a little homework there. So we're getting down to the end of the submitted questions. I had a few that were submitted this morning as well, and looks like we're doing okay on time. So we'll try to get to the ones that were submitted this morning. But I got a request from somebody, and I don't know if we should answer this if the farm's in Michigan. I don't know. We might have to be careful about answering it. But they mentioned they got a 160-acre farm, 53 acres under till, the remainder in woods and swamp, and they've had some harvesting over the years, but despite of the harvesting and despite of getting light to the forest floor, they're not seeing the ferns and the natural regeneration taking place. And could this be a result of overgrazing? And then they added the herd population is high. While hunting last fall, I would typically see 20 to 40 deer in an afternoon. There may have been too many deer on the farm for about 50 years. So I don't think they need our advice. I think they answered it right on. And I actually asked for some follow-up questions, and they sent me some video and some pictures. And the pictures, I think, tell a lot of that story. If you really look in here, you're seeing a pretty distinct browse line and not a lot happening under this forest. So my guess is deer densities are largely part of that problem, and in heavy agriculture areas that can be a distinct issue. John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not really, other than the fact that it sounds like with the high deer densities that you have a really good opportunity there to share that resource with other people. So that'd be an opportunity to take more people hunting, people that don't normally seek out trophy animals. So the goal would be to remove as many does as you can to kind of knock that herd back.
And once you've had legacy deer issues, high deer densities for a long time, you think about it, you know, anything that tries to sprout, it's gone so quickly. If you've got a forested area that over time the deer population built, you know, you might be able to get it turned around quicker, but it's really tough at deer densities like that. So step number one is probably to try to get those deer densities down. If you've got some areas you want to try to just see what's going on, if you can put up even some small deer exclosures, it's amazing to look at the difference in what happens inside of an area that you keep deer out of. But probably the answer to that would be to reduce your deer densities or do something to make it harder for them to have some impact. Even if you tried to plant trees without big tall tree tubes, the deer are probably gonna hammer whatever you put out there. So if you've got any size property at all that you want to try to have an impact on, then reducing deer densities is probably a key. And that's not real common in a lot of Ohio. Down here in Southeast Ohio, our deer densities are much lower than that. And they usually aren't the driving force that affects our regeneration. But near urban areas, or if you're a little woodlot in a sea of agriculture, when the corn and soybeans are gone, they're hanging out a lot in those woodlands and spend a lot of time. So not shocking that that's part of the problem.
Dave and John, we actually had a question in the chat about how much of a problem is deer overgrazing. So I think that kind of helped cover Ohio and Michigan, that last question.
I actually led a study here in Southeast Ohio looking at the impacts of deer on the regeneration of our hardwood species. And in short, it's highly variable across the state, but in most of the state, our deer densities are not like they could be and not like they were in some of the states to our east. But we do have pockets where deer densities, especially in the urban areas and urban fringe areas, where deer are definitely driving the ecosystem. And then realize deer have preferences. So there are some species that they're going to go after, even if there aren't many deer at all, they're going to have a major impact on. Other species they don't like as well, so they're going to impact less. But kudos to Division of Forestry or Division of Wildlife. They've done a great job of managing our deer herds. They keep an eye on population densities. When they get high, you'll see the deer limit, how many deer you can take in a county, go up. And as the populations start to dwindle, they'll lower that. So we've done a much better job than, say, New York and Pennsylvania to our east, where they've had several years in a row or decades where they've had deer densities 80 deer per square mile, which are going to consume all your forest regeneration if you get that high. I don't know what our numbers are now, John, but we're probably closer to 20 in most of our counties or less deer per square mile.
Yeah, I don't have any hard statistics on that.
Yeah, so we've done a really good job overall in the state of managing those deer herds.
We tend to use hunter attitude surveys and landowner and agricultural attitude surveys, and then our harvest of that particular year to determine kind of where we're at as far as deer numbers.
And Ohio's been good for a long time at encouraging taking does out of the herd, where some of the states it's kind of was taboo for years to harvest a doe for any reason. But when you take a doe out of the woods, you're taking 2 or 3, sometimes 4 out of the future herd. So it's real important to harvest some does if you're getting high deer densities. A new question that just came in, so we're not super prepared to answer this one. But they've got cottonwood that's coming in in a plantation where there's 12-year-old planting of oak, river birch, sycamore, black walnut, black cherry on a bottomland site, and what's the best way to control it? And I think I inadvertently got rid of that they had actually used, or no, that's a different question. I'm getting merged in my brain here. So what's the best approach on a 12-year-old planting? And Stephanie, you got any thoughts on that one?
We were talking a little bit before. We're guessing if it's a 12-year-old planting, your cottonwood trees are already getting too big to bush hog. So like keeping competing vegetation down in between your rows is going to help some. But at this point, if you take the cottonwood trees out, they're going to resprout and they're going to grow very quickly, just like they would coming into your area. So you'll probably have to treat those stumps if you don't want that competition in your plantation. Either take them out and treat the stumps, or use a basal application very carefully so you don't injure any other plants in that area. But you will probably have to treat them.
Yeah, probably the biggest thing to do is get someone out there that's a forester to look and see if they're really a problem, you know, or because having some cottonwood mixed in may be acceptable, but if there's so many of them that they're going to be the dominant canopy, then you probably need to manage it. So again, probably cutting them and treating the stumps if it's a problem you need to address. That's the best way. And I don't like to give herbicide recommendations without knowing more specifics. So feel free to reach out to me and we'll try to point you in the right direction. Not treat a lot of cottonwoods. So not sure the best herbicide mix to use. And we just got this question recently.
So you have to be really careful with what you pick, especially in a bottomland site, because you're probably close to a water source. And so you really want to use caution if you go that route. Make sure you consult a professional and get some advice and follow your pesticide label. Make sure you're doing everything correctly.
Yep. And then another option could be to cut it, let it resprout and treat some foliage as well. So again, there's a lot of variables there, and we don't, it's like giving a prescription to someone if you're a doctor without seeing the patient. So we kind of like to get somebody out there to see what's going on. Tom, you want to talk a little bit about butternut?
Sure. Yeah. So what is the status of butternut in Ohio? Are there any restoration projects that are ongoing in Ohio? So butternut is a native tree species related to black walnut, a little bit different bark and fruit. But yeah, they're really pretty rare now in Ohio, and they've been really devastated by a disease called butternut canker, which is actually pretty closely related to the same fungal disease that causes chestnut blight. But this disease really swept through the state, I believe, in the mid 1900s. And so it pretty effectively wiped out nearly all the butternut in Ohio. You can still come across them occasionally. And yeah, as far as restoration projects, so we have partnered with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. They've been involved with some work to try to restore butternut, and so they've made some seedlings available to us here in Ohio for planting, and then for monitoring down the road to see how they perform against the canker, if they succumb to it or are able to tolerate it. So I think and Dave's showing that page there. I'll also include a link here in the chat to more information about all the efforts that the U.S. Forest Service is doing. They're kind of leading the way on butternut conservation in this part of the country. But I think a lot of the butternuts that you come across nowadays in Ohio probably are not pure genetic native butternut. I think some research has shown that most of these persisting butternuts are probably a hybrid that have some genetics from Japanese heartnut, which is an Asian walnut species that was fairly widely planted by walnut growers in years ago, not as widely planted anymore, but they readily hybridize with our native butternut. And they have more resistance or tolerance to that butternut canker disease. So that is probably why these hybrids are able to persist out there, because they have some of those genes from the Asian species that let them tolerate the disease. So that's sort of the status on butternut, and the U.S. Forest Service is really kind of leading the way on that conservation work.
And the division has played a role for a long time. I know service foresters going back several years, probably decades, have worked with the geneticists out of Purdue and the Forest Service to collect some of that material and to look at the butternuts they're finding out in the woods and determine whether they're, you know, the native or the hybrids of, or the pure heartnut. So
yep,
they've played a role in that over the years. So this was the last question. I added a couple more, but I wanted to make sure we got through this one, and then we'll take the couple new ones that just came in. But what are some native trees or shrubs that grow quickly and produce mast for wildlife? So the first part of that question is, what's mast? And really, it's any kind of fruit that's produced by a tree or a shrub that is used for wildlife. So every tree species out there produces some kind of fruit that wildlife benefit from. Some is more valuable than others, but gosh, I grew up squirrel hunting, and you know, obviously you think about the nut producers is where you're going to find the squirrels, but when there aren't a lot of acorns or hickory nuts, or it's too early in the season, you'll see squirrels eating sugar maple fruits and the green cones on yellow poplar tulip tree. So they're all beneficial. We do typically break mast into two categories. One is hard mast, which is, it's a fruit or a food reserve that's available in the winter months, like acorns and hickory nuts. And then the other is soft mast, which is more of what we think about a fruit, like a black cherry or a plum or something like that, an apple. So they're all valuable. It's good to have a variety and a mix. And usually the ones that produce quickly are more soft mast than hard mast. It takes longer to produce hard mast for most species. We do have a publication for that. It's a fact sheet that I helped write a few years back with Stan Garrett, who's our wildlife specialist with OSU Extension. And there are tables in here that talk about different species of trees and shrubs and what species of wildlife depend on them. So that's a good resource for you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this topic. We'll let John pitch in a little bit too, but our next topic for our next Day in the Woods program is native trees and shrubs for wildlife. So that is going to be the focus of that presentation on March 12th. We've got Ryan Boyer from NWTF and Marnie Tichenol from OSU, both wildlife specialists, and myself, and we're going to talk quite a bit about mast and what you can do in your woodlands to enhance it. Of the hard mast producers, the one that's probably the quickest is one that many people don't really think about a lot, is hazelnut. It's a shrub that produces a hard fruit that is available for wildlife, and it stores pretty well, but it's also so delicious that it doesn't last long because they eat it pretty quick. So I don't know, John, you want to add anything to that? Or
not necessarily that. There are some hybrid oak species that are used in tree plantings sometimes that will produce mast fairly quickly. I'm not 100% sure what they are. I want to say sawtooth oak, maybe. I can't remember, but within 10 years, they're producing acorns. As far
sawtooth's a non-native oak that
right. I understand, but there are others that you'd have to be careful and get advice on, you know, what to plant. But Chinese chestnut, you know, can produce fairly quickly compared to, say, American beech, which may take years and years and years before, and they're not reliable. That's the other thing to think about in mast, is every year, from year to year, it varies, and some trees are more reliable than others in producing mast, especially hard mast. So, and it depends on the stage of succession your property's in. Most of the early successional young forest habitat, like you mentioned, it's going to be soft mast. So if you want to plant something and get a quick result, probably go with species that are soft mass producers.
And really, a lot of times you may have more out there than you realize, and you can do some management to enhance what you've already got. You got some smaller trees that are close to being able to produce mass. You can do some thinning around them. You can do some bush hogging on a rotation to get things like blackberries and raspberries that are going to be fairly quick. So a lot of times there's management you can do to enhance what you've already got. And that's a lot of times getting that private lands biologist and forester out there to help you is a good approach. Okay, let's see. So that was the last question that we had on that we really prepared for. And with that, folks can stay or leave when, depending on their time schedule, but we had a couple more questions submitted that we're going to kind of wing here. But again, I want to remind you, this recording, we will post it at this site fairly shortly. And remember that if you'll go to this same site, you can actually, we'll have the information on how to register for the next program fairly shortly. With that, I got a question about Oriental Bittersweet. And they've actually tried to treat Oriental Bittersweet by cutting and treating the stumps with 25% triclopyr and diesel fuel. Are there any recommendations? Well, my first thought on that is, again, with herbicide recommendations, we got to be very careful because 25% triclopyr could mean something totally different depending on what you're looking at. Most of the time, triclopyr is in an herbicide, and it's probably at about a 50% rate to start with. So when you follow the label recommendation of probably 20% of the herbicide, you're having about half the rate of triclopyr. So we got to be careful when we use that terminology. But and then the other thing is bittersweet's a vine that's right in close proximity to a trunk of a tree. So we got to be really careful on what we recommend, because if we did a traditional basil spray and got it on the trunk of the tree that we were treating, we could damage it. So we need to be very careful with our herbicide recommendations. The best advice I can give is connect with me or another extension professional or a forester to make sure you're using the right herbicide at the right rate. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the timing. A lot of woody plants, when we're treating, if we're doing a cut stump treatment late in the growing season when trees and shrubs are ready to put the resources in the root system, is the best time to do that. So it may be a timing thing. And then the other thing to do is you almost always need to do follow-up treatments because you don't always get them all and it's not always effective. So sometimes you need to go back and do follow-up treatments. You may be able to do foliar treatments on if you've got trees or vines that have resprouted. So again, I don't want to give real specifics on which herbicides to use, but if you want to connect with me and we'll get more of the story, we'll see what we can do about making more recommendations. Stephanie or Tom, you have anything to add to that discussion at all?
No, I agree. Yeah, trying to work with extension person or a forester on that to get the correct recommendations and talk through, how established it is, what tools you have available, and the best way forward is my recommendation.
Another thing to look at is the actual cut stump treatment method. If you're using the oil-based chemical, triclopyr and diesel, you don't just treat the top of the stump. You also have to do the sides and any root flares. You may just not have enough chemical on it to be effective if you're only treating that freshly cut surface. So it's a little bit different application with different chemicals.
And when you're dealing with a vine, you got such a small surface area to treat that just may not be enough chemical to actually do it as well on Oriental Bittersweet. But we've got some foresters in Eastern Ohio have dealt with this a lot more than I have too, so we can do a little more homework on that one as well to see if they found another herbicide that might work better. This one I want to say, we actually got this question from a young man up in Hocking County who wants us to talk a little bit about our careers in forestry and wildlife, but we're going to save that till the end and probably do that one-on-one with Liam. So if you'll hang on, I'll hang on, and maybe Stephanie can, or Tom can help me out with that. And I also, before we close, Jessica and Danielle, how many other questions do we have? We'll try to address as many of those as we can within a reasonable amount of time. We'll hang on here for another 15 minutes or so and try to get those questions answered as best we can. So if you guys want to help out and sort through those questions, I'd appreciate it.
So we had several questions related to ash tree and emerald ash borer. One of them was related to who to contact in order to get a risk assessment for a tree falling on someone. Some of them were related to the disappearing EAB and multiflora rose coming with openings in canopy. Should they actively replace trees or other natives to reproduce? Things like that.
Tom, you want to, since it's an insect question, you want to?
Yeah, as far as the dying ash trees and the risk assessment, is that what you mean?
Sure.
Yeah, that's, yeah, a lot of people are having to deal with that, you know, over the last, 10 years or more here in Ohio with a lot of ash trees being killed from EAB. So yeah, to do a thorough, tree risk assessment, we always recommend folks work with a certified arborist to do that. And I just put a link to the Ohio Certified Arborist website, and you can input your zip code and find certified arborists in your area. But those would be the professionals I would point you to do such an assessment for a potential hazard tree. Would be a International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist.
And if it's in just a general wooded setting, if you've got standing dead ash trees and you're worried about them, frankly, I don't worry a lot about standing dead trees unless they're near a building or near a road or a trail that I frequent, if it's like over my tree stand where I sit a lot. But the thing to keep in mind is that you're probably putting yourself in a lot more risk to try to cut that tree down than to let it just fall apart naturally, because the odds of you getting injured is going to be a lot higher when you try to actively take it down. If you got a woods just totally full of ash and they're all dead, then obviously it's if it's windy or you just need to be careful in that area. But if you go to actively cut them down, it's very hard to cut down. And I actually asked one of our chainsaw training specialists the best way to do it safely, and they said stand up because you're a smaller target. So that was his way of saying don't do it unless you're really experienced. Because when you start cutting a tree that's got small dead branches up there, they can come down on you, and it's hard to do it safely. As far as planting and actively replacing the ash, Stephanie, you want to talk about that one briefly?
Yeah, I know there were some questions about invasive plants, and whenever you have a disturbance that opens up the canopy, you're most likely going to have at least some invasive plants to deal with. And so that might be your first step. It's just making sure you control those invasives. And then take a look at what you have. You might have some really good regeneration coming in on its own, and you might not need to do a whole lot. But if you're not seeing good species or even numbers of trees that you want, if you have a good canopy gap, you have sunlight, underplanting is an option, but it's going to be trickier than just planting trees in an open field, because you're going to have competition. You're going to have other plants in the area. It may require a little bit of maintenance, cleaning out around them, controlling some of those other plants that are coming in to make sure they survive. It can be done. It's just harder than planting an open area into tree seedlings.
Thanks, Stephanie. Danielle or Jessica, other questions that we've missed?
There was one question to go along with number 4 about vernal pools, and I think it was kind of answered already. But they're wondering if there's a need to worry about mosquitoes and breeding in vernal pools. Should they be kept safe certain distance from a house to minimize the risk of mosquitoes?
John, you're ready to answer that. Jump
I
in.
think with vernal pools, if a vernal pool is designed and constructed correctly, and it dries up effectively, I think that will minimize the mosquito problem. If it retains water year round and it just becomes a stagnant wet pool, then yeah, it's going to be a breeding ground. So I guess that's why it's critical to make sure that you're not going, any deeper than 12 inches deep when you're making your vernal pool. And, I guess you probably don't want it right next to your house anyway. So that's all I got on that.
I can look out my window and look into a wetland with button bush everywhere in it. And I don't think we have any more mosquitoes here than anybody else. We have a chorus of spring peepers here coming up here. I'm looking forward to in the next month or so. But if it's a healthy ecosystem, the predators out there take care of your mosquito population. So shouldn't be a big issue.
I would say put up a few bat houses and let the bats have fun.
Yeah, that's a good response too. I do see one from Frank about legacy planning, and that's a whole topic we can't get into a lot. And let's see, how's he worded, but they're redoing a forest management plan. They want to make legacy planning part of it. Forester said it's rare for people to do that. Why is this not encouraged more? I really think legacy planning is huge. For those of you that don't really understand what we're talking about legacy planning, we're talking about planning what's going to happen to your woodland when it transitions to the next owner, which means it's some hard discussions to have, because you got to talk a little bit about death and who's going to inherit your property or who's going to have it after you're gone. And landowners generally don't like to have those discussions. But to me, when land changes hands, especially if you got multiple heirs, if you haven't done your homework and planned well, then a lot of times it gets split among heirs. They all have different ideas for the property, and then the property gets broken into smaller and smaller pieces, making it less beneficial for the future. So it's one of those things you really need to think about. We are hoping to do a lot more programming in the legacy arena to give landowners options. It's good to put that in a management plan, but that's only one piece of legacy planning. It's about having the discussions. It's about having legal advice from lawyers to make sure that you have all your documentation in order as to how that land's going to be passed on. It's financial planning. It's complicated. But the first step is to have those discussions with family members and start thinking about, equal versus equitable. And, maybe you got an 80-acre woodland and maybe you don't split it equally among your 4 kids. Maybe you find ways, the one that maybe the most interested gets the woodland, but the other ones get some other assets. And so thinking about that and the best way to deal with that. Because what happens a lot of times when it's inherited, the tax burden is such that some of it gets sold. So you just need to plan ahead, and you need to really understand, that whole process, and stay tuned. We're hoping to do more programming in that arena. We're actually gonna, hopefully, Central State University will take the lead on some of our efforts. And that's going to be a priority area for them, especially here in Southeastern Ohio. So it's definitely on our radar screen, but we just haven't had the resources to deal with it as effectively as we'd like. Other questions out there, Danielle or Jessica?
Dave, we have about 13 open questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
Trying to kind of weed through them and see if we've answered some of them.
I'm seeing them too, Jessica. So the one about lesser celandine, I have no experience with lesser celandine. So Sandy, if you want to reach out, Tom or Stephanie, do you have experience with that?
Not personally, but that's one, it kind of forms a ground cover, especially in wet wooded areas. I think that one's important with the early detection. If you can find early patches of it on your land to try to eliminate it either with hand pulling or herbicides. But I think in those really large, heavily infested areas, you know, chemical control might be the really only efficient way to do it. But, you know, obviously, like we've said before, I'd caution folks to work with a professional forester or someone with extension to get some more, you know, tailored advice on how to do that the right way. Especially because a lot of these are growing in, you know, wet riparian areas. We don't want to be, you know, misapplying pesticides in those areas, but I think that could be an option, you know, if you're careful about not hitting non-target, you know, other native species that might be present. But yeah, it can be a nightmare to bear because it starts to take over the whole forest floor. But
Okay. Thank you, Tom. I have a question from David about best ways to optimize sugar bush and encourage sugar maple growth. Probably the best thing to do is make sure you got a good sugar maple site is one of the things. If you don't have the right kind of site and soil conditions, it's tough to get sugar maple to be successful. So that depends on, I don't know where you're from, but it depends on where you are in the state. There's a lot more forest dominated by sugar maple as you go into the northeastern part of the state. As you get down here in the southern part of the state, you're probably looking at lower elevations, eastern and northern facing slopes is where you would want to manage for sugar maple. And then it becomes, really, it's not a hard one to get into a forest if you're on the right site because it'll tend to be in the understory and work its way up. So again, working with your local service forester, identifying those trees, but the sugar maples that produce the most syrup or the most sap are the ones with the bigger and healthier crowns. So it's all about looking at crowns, getting them spaced appropriately, and then getting light to those crowns. But you want to, there's a balance there. So that's probably about all we can do with that one. Again, if you want to reach out to me, I'd be glad to hook you up. Gary Graham with Ohio State University Extension is our maple specialist. He's up in Holmes County, and he's a great resource for maple woodland management. Question from Brian about a local surveyor in Fairfield County. I don't think we can help much with local. I don't really have a contact up there to know the best way to do that. There is, and I don't have it in top of my brain, but there is a professional organization for surveyors, and they have a web presence. Beyond that, I don't know how to answer that one. I'd reach out to your local extension office in Fairfield County and see if they've got contacts or your local soil and water. Joanne's asking about a list of potential priorities for woodland ownership goals. Wow, that's almost unlimited. It really comes down to you as woodland owners. But I would highly recommend going to the My Land Plan site, mylandplan.org. They've got some really good broad categories of woodland owner objectives and lots of resources there. So that might be a great place to go and look for resources on ownership goals. That's mylandplan.org. In what way are ancient indigenous forest management practice reflected in modern best practices? That's a good question, and I don't know that we've got a lot of expertise on that. I'm assuming fire is part of what, and the question moved on me, so I can't get the name of the person who asked that question, but we're learning more and more the importance of fire in management of woodlands, and we're really doing our best to try to understand that role and trying to make that an option, because that's probably one of the bigger tools that they used, and we're in our infancy as far as understanding it. But we do know that our oak-dominated forests were highly dependent on fire, and they're part of the reason why we have so much oak-dominated forests. Okay. And I am not familiar with that term, hugelkultur, H-U-G-E-L culture. Is anybody familiar with that term on the panel?
I think it's where you have like dead wood material that you kind of pile and let sit, and then you use it as a seed bed. And I may be completely wrong on that, Claudia, so feel free to correct me. But it would depend on what species you want to plant. I mean, a lot of our species around here, the wood breaks down naturally very quickly in the forest. We don't have an ecosystem that really relies on those nursery logs, as they're called. And let's see, a raised garden bed built with log sticks and branches. Basically a compost heap that you can use. It may make sense, like small scale, if you have certain plants that you really want to grow in your backyard. I don't know that you'd really want to try to implement this large scale in your forest. And there are some ecosystems like Pacific Northwest where a lot of your species really rely on those raised beds that are caused by down logs and down material. But it's not so much something you see here in Ohio a lot. We have a lot of things breaking down.
So
In the
Stephanie,
woods,
when you,
it's-
oh, go ahead.
No, she just followed up. It could be a seed bed, but wondering if there's any purpose in the woods. I don't know how practical it would be on a big enough scale to do much in your woods. Small scale, you could add some nutrients in a small place in your woods, but I mean, this is going to be a really focused effort, I would think. Go ahead, Dave.
Is anybody else having the breakup in the audio, or is it just me hearing it on my end? It seems like everybody else is talking. It's really acting weird on my end, but just curious. So it's coming through clear for everybody else out there? Good.
I've gotten a warning a couple times that my internet's unstable, so I don't know.
Well, it's not just you. Jessica's voice was breaking up too, and Tom's did for a while too. So it may be my internet connection.
That I don't know much about it. Just a general idea.
Okay, question from Donna, and it's a long one. So does anybody want to address that one? Are you guys seeing it? Trying to replace dead ash. They're having deer issues. We keep trying and fence the saplings, or just let nature take its course. Again, I would get boots on the ground, get an experienced forester out there to assess your situation. Fencing may be an option, but it's an expensive one. There are tools out there you can use. You could actually put tree tubes on just a few per acre and help pull a few through so you have some diversity. If you've got some unique specimens, you might want to focus on helping get those few up through. But it's going to be hard to answer that specifically without seeing it. But putting out seed can't hurt, but the odds of many of them making it without, some real expertise in there to help you, I think is not very likely. How do we remove ironwood from understory? I heard they're hard on chainsaws. Well, they're not truly iron. They are hard. But if you've got a good sharp chain, a chainsaw can work. I don't see ironwood, and ironwood could be a couple different species. It could be a carpinus, and I'm drawing a blank on the other one. Just having them.
Yeah, Ostraya virginiana.
Australia.
Yep.
Carpinus or Australia. One's commonly called, both of them are commonly called ironwood. I wouldn't go about removing them unless you had a specific reason to. If it's inhibiting desired regeneration where you're going to get light to that area and you're going to regenerate it. But if you're not in that regeneration phase, I would probably leave it. There's somebody benefiting from it out there. Songbirds are probably eating the seeds on those two species. So I wouldn't probably remove it unless you had a real specific reason to do it. Best evergreen to add an edge for privacy. Wow, evergreens are tough anymore. Fungal diseases are just off the charts right now. And most of our evergreens are struggling, and they're tough to get established and to stay established. We've had periods of extremely wet soil conditions followed by late season dry conditions. And then I think the fungal populations in the air are just off the charts. So I would really reach out to your local forester, your local extension specialist, because it's impossible to answer that question without knowing your soil conditions. And so, that's a site-specific recommendation. And the one evergreen screen that a lot of people like, arborvitae, is beautiful and great, but deer love it. It's deer candy. So again, I'd be very cautious and get some help. And when in doubt, add some diversity. Relying on one species is sometimes a problem, because if you lose one, you're probably going to lose them all. Anybody want to address a good source for native hardwood seeds? I haven't really thought that one through much to know how to answer that one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not aware really, other than, you know, trying to collect your own. I know that, you know, some like local metro park districts and stuff have had some efforts, like citizen science efforts, for people to go collect acorns or hickory nuts or something, and, you know, bring it back to the park district for germinating and then later planting them out. But that's more of a citizen effort to go collect those. You know, there's some bare root tree seedling nurseries out there that can help you get a hold of seedlings, but as far as actual seeds, I'm not sure on that.
Okay. I can't add to that either, so apologize. We don't have a better answer. Creeping Jenny. I don't have any experience with creeping Jenny, so I don't know how to answer that question.
As far as I know on that one, it probably behaves similarly to lesser celandine. So yeah, contacting an expert to think about control measures or ways to deal with that one would probably be a good step.
And then the last one that I think is open is from Stan about, they've got an 80-acre woodland property surrounded by thousands of acres of woods, much is being clear cut. We are rapidly becoming a forest oasis. How will this timbering affect our woods? Anybody want to give that a shot?
Well, if they're interested in managing for turkeys on their property, their property is probably going to be the only place where turkeys can roost. So I guess there's a benefit to that. Yeah,
and I live next to some large tracts of timber industry land too. And what they do does have an effect, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And it's hard to know what kind of effect. It definitely affect what animals and where they spend their time and the wildlife habitat component. But beyond that, it's really tough to know what all those effects might be. You know, how the harvesting's done and so on. So that's a tough one. I'm not sure we can really address that one very effectively.
You may need to watch for invasive plants a little more closely. They're creating disturbance and there's already a seed source. They may become more prevalent, may seed into your woods. So just keeping an eye out for things like that would be a good start.
Well, I've got almost 20 after. There is one comment about chinkapin as being a quick producer of acorns, so I wanted to bring that out. It is one of the earlier ones, and believe it or not, bur oak produces pretty quickly. As a young tree will produce acorns pretty quickly of our native oaks, but most oaks, we're talking decades before we're going to get any of our oaks producing seed. But chinkapin is probably one of the quicker ones. It's definitely more common in areas that are underlined by limestone or shale bedrock. You don't see a ton of that in the eastern part of the states unless you got these little limestone lenses. So with that, I think really appreciate my panel and all the input and all the preparation to get hopefully most of your questions answered. My contact is on the screen, so feel free to reach out if you need follow-up or have other questions. And I think that's pretty well going to conclude for the day. So really appreciate everybody hanging with us for the 2 hours and 20 minutes we've been on.